And here is part 2. I have returned from Hawaii, so you're going to get a great deal of my enthusiasm in the aftermath fireworks of data curation. So what is data deposit? I wanted to unpack this a little bit, given that in our previous slides, we were talking about how data deposit is made possible, right, by the work of scientists. And it's a great deal of work, and it's all in service of making data aggregated as a single body of information that can be searched. So what do we even mean? What do we mean by data deposit? Well, Christine Borgman, defines it as submitting data to some kind of institution, a database, a repository, and synonymous with depositing data is data submission here. So you've probably experienced this yourself, that some funders and journals require scientists, social scientists in this particular study, to deposit data to a repository in order to publish. So it's instrumental to having your publication published that you submit and share your data to a repository in this federated way, in a way that is available for further sharing, as well as to check for transparency, reproducibility, etc. So databases for the social sciences, and specifically for qualitative data, include ICPSR, the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, Dataverse at Harvard, might have heard of that one, and institutional repositories like the University of Arizona or Syracuse University, or your university probably has an institutional repository for publications. They might have one for data as well. Now, have we seen this wonderful animation before? Yes, we have. Here, this is representing the workflow for social scientists who are submitting specifically to ICPSR, but we could generalize this beyond the ICPSR experience, which I will dive into in a little more depth. So let's say you get funding from the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice requires you to share your data once the study that they funded has been completed, or a part of that has been completed. Now, you might submit that to a repository in which the staff reviews it, makes sure that it's anonymized if it's human subjects data. And then this is an iterative process, right? That once you submit qualitative data, often you're going to go into a cycle of reviewing the data, submitting the data, making revisions. And the ICPSR, as with these other repositories, it is not generic per se. It might be highly specific to the kind of repository you're submitting to. Here's an example of ICPSR in which you have a series of steps that you need to take, including a data dissemination agreement. There might be some or just a portion of these activities that you will engage in. So that's a broad view of data deposit, but let's take an even further step back. And what is the social science research environment? What does that look like right now? Well, right now, there are federal investments in cyber infrastructure, specifically to accelerate data-intensive science. Wait a minute, you say. The social sciences are not a type of cyber infrastructure. They're not submitting data to an infrastructure that is considered cyber infrastructure. Well, I'm sorry, my friend, you would be wrong. Not entirely unjustified, but it turns out that social science data archives, right, are a type of cyber infrastructure. And we refer to this often as e-science, right? So under the broad umbrella of we are going to be sharing, describing, standardizing our data so that we can accelerate data-intensive sciences using these digital platforms, using cyber infrastructure. So keep your mind wide open there and consider how qualitative data is also when it's submitted to a repository, is also a type of cyber infrastructure. So federal investments do exist, right, for curating qualitative data. Now, we also see data quality principles characterizing the social science research environment. These include stewardship principles like FAIR, heard of it, or CARE. FAIR is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible. CARE includes community-oriented values. We will have to dive further into those. Happy to provide a citation for the CARE data principles. Those are specific to Indigenous data, and the idea is that you can ensure an ethical and responsible and community-controlled data. So even though we have FAIR principles, even though we have these stewardship and guidelines, we still have some lack of convergence on norms in this that characterizes the social science research environment. So there are a few policy incentives. The NSF and DOJ do have data management plan requirements, but they are a-specific and faculty are often using their discretion to complete these. There are some data standards, for example, dataset annotation metadata, but these are sometimes uncontrolled. They're not controlled vocabularies. As well, lack of cultural norms. Sure, the open science movement has been gaining traction, but to what extent do the combination of lack of policy incentives and the lack of cultural norms around sharing data lead to a rather fragmented research environment for submitting, depositing social science data? Now, this spans all across academia, industry, and government. There's unstructured qualitative data there. And as well, this implicates what has been called the T-shaped and pie-shaped researcher. Now, who has heard of the pie-shaped researcher? Well, this has been a type of researcher who is not only has domain specificity, that depth, the T, the deep, and also breadth of knowledge, which is the top of the T. Now add to that classic researcher a statistics and computing expertise or knowledge. This is an addition that comes along with cyber infrastructure enabled science and indeed social science. Now, we're going to be looking specifically at this particular repository, which is the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, housed at the University of Michigan. Now, what do we see here in its development? Well, we see that ICPSR was actually founded in 1962. So you could say that this has been around for quite a while. And there's been some movements toward legitimizing and also building in more maturity for the data deposit infrastructure. This included training and education programs, specialty data archives that were created to house specific collections, and a voluntary association with the repository. Now, these combined such that the social science research environment for data deposit became more mature. So ICPSR is an interesting case to take for studying how social science data is fit to repositories. So here, previous studies have looked at this science as data deposit as a practice. They've specifically looked at data work practices. As well, they've taken a focus on data workers. Now, a lot of this work is occurring in computer-supported cooperative work, as well as information science studies and STS, as well as sociology. So this is a highly interdisciplinary body of work. Now, so far, this STS, CSCW, information science, sociology, scholarship, and beyond shows that, data sharing and reuse and integration, it takes significant work. They've outlined also the factors and obstacles to data. However, we often see what's on the other end of the data production cycle. We don't often see the causal arrow going in the other way. What do I mean by that? How do repositories impact scientific practice? A great deal of the work has looked at data reuse, data reintegration, and when we have completed our data management protocols, when we have completed our study. However, what about the earlier stages when we're preparing data for deposit? How do repository standards and the requirements to fit your data to repositories affect practice? And so in this study, I argue that scientists are engaging in data fitting. What does this mean? Scientists are making their data legible, readable by the repository and fit the repository, conforming to those requirements of the repository as they submit their data. And sometimes some of those practices of fitting your data, describing them with the metadata that exist, uploading them in such a manner that the computer can understand the format and also the length requirements, etc., they can be awkward. They can be something that a social scientist has never done before. They can be sort of out of the natural routines that existed before you submitted data. When they are awkward, ungainly, or unnatural, they can be called contortions. And so based on this provocation and this argument that scientists are engaging in fitting practices, we are going to ask, how? How do social scientists make their data fit the repository? How do they make it machine readable? By submitting it to these repositories. And we are, plot spoiler, going to say that is through data fitting practices. And then the second question guiding this study is, what are the impacts of this data fitting on long-term research data sustainability? What we referred to earlier as sustainability is not in the eco-friendly sense. In some parts it is, but in this sense, we're actually drawing from Irene Pesqueto's work, who looked at long-term sustainability of infrastructures like repositories. And this is just a long timeline. So how do we curate over the long run? And plot spoiler, we are arguing that data fitting does make data fair. However, it can lead to what we're calling data contortions. And this, again, is those ungainly activities that occur when you're submitting data to the repository. So our study design. Well, so we designed the study as a case study. This is an initial foray that we're still doing some ongoing data collection. It's a case study of social scientists who deposited qualitative data to ICPSR. Our data collection was comprised of semi-structured interviews, 15 in total so far, and we drew from grounded theory-inspired approaches to do content analysis of the interviews. Now we have a span of social scientists across disciplines, including sociology, epidemiology, health sciences, criminology. And one important piece that I want you to take away from this kind of exciting slide, there's a lot going on, is that they were all managing grant-funded projects as project investigators. Now, this is important to note because it means that they had an incentive potentially, right, to submit their data. So for example, 5 were funded by the National Institute of Justice, 5 were funded by the NIH, and others, 7 were funded by foundations. So we have a diversity of funding here that may have led to some motivation to submit the data in the first place to ICPSR. Now, some of these were in-person interviews, but some of the collection occurred over COVID, so they were Zoom interviews. I also collected data management documents where appropriate, when they came up within the interviews. Now, our data analysis proceeded with a constant comparative approach, as well as drawing from grounded theoretical approach. Now, we began very inductively. We emphasized data deposit practices just in the beginning and really surfaced the fact that there was a lot of fitting going on, thinking about how do I get my data to conform to the requirements of the repository? How do I get my data to fit the existing subject headings for the type of data that this is? How do I make it more visible to our intended audiences by describing it in the documentation? How do I make sure that I am complying with all of the anonymization requirements of ICPSR, working with staff, that kind of thing? So this fitting came up in our first round. And then in the second round, we specifically looked for fitting again with this lens. And we drew from theory and knowledge infrastructures to identify fitting practices that produce the initial codes and themes. Now, data fitting practices, what we found in our first round was what we're defining as the activities scientists engage in to conform data to repository requirements. What does this look like? Well, let's say a scientist produces some data. Maybe it was an interview with some participants for a youth study. Now, they needed to get to the repository, but often it couldn't span the gap from the lab to the repository due to not being able to comply with some of the requirements of the data repository. However, all of my participants did submit their data. So how did they make that possible? And how did they do that given the requirement to make it machine readable, to make it legible to the repository? So the first thing we found was scientists were creating and appropriating resources to get across that bridge. What do these include? These included, let's see, lab handbooks, data plans, templates for analysis, and training materials. For example, this wonderful health sciences researcher was using this document in order to standardize the protocol for collecting data. so that they were anticipating submitting the data to ICPSR, and they knew that they needed to have consistent fields and consistency in the way that they were collecting the data. So they trained their interviewees to pronounce the medical terminology correctly and had standardized definitions. For example, dronabinol, brandmerinol, pronunciation. They made sure they were standardizing the pronunciation in the interviews. So you get accurately collected data and also in the correct order of the questions that you are asking. Another example of how they got their data from the lab to the repository is they created these qualitative analysis instructions and descriptions, so these templates that supported the work. And they said, once you have been assigned a focus group or interview, start with this template. And they have these in structured columns so that each of the analysis questions were then pasted into these well-structured, machine-readable formats, such as a CSV or even a Google Sheet. Another example was a checklist. So this is just to support your routines when you are going through your human subjects disclosure checklist. So here we saw that there was some rules that they required their interview participants to follow. Now, because of this, the data plans, the templates, the lab handbooks, training materials, the data were successfully able to be deposited. They were able to be fit into the repository because of these extra structures. Now that we see that data is fit and we see how we were able to make that data fit the repository with these other resources, we can ask, what are the impacts of this work, especially when we see them potentially changing some of their lab practices, such as producing templates, handbooks, manuals? Well, we found that depositing data does make it more findable, accessible, interoperable, reproducible, because now the data is standardized, as we saw in our previous example, that we would see data that is in a format that's potentially aggregatable with other data sets. However, sometimes when the fitting to the repository was not what aligned with prior practices, this is what we call data contortions. Now, a more specific and more formal definition that we're working with right now is some ungainly or awkward or unnatural actions scientists take to align data sets with repository requirements. Now, what we found is that this ranges on a spectrum, right? Data contortions can be anything from, this is not my usual series of steps that I take when I'm depositing my data. Usually we don't really manage our data in a way that is reproducible. We don't document provenance. We don't collect paradata, right? So there might be, oh, I have to create a data management plan. Like that's a little bit that's new to me, that's awkward to me. But on the other end of the spectrum, we did find that there was conflicts with, for example, priorities to protect privacy, but also to preserve integrity at the same time. You're probably familiar with this. You have an interview. You need to anonymize it to protect your participants' privacy, but you also need to submit that data. You need to share it because of the mandate of your funder that says you need to share your data. Does not specify how to anonymize it, does not specify the extent to which you can be sure that it is fully anonymized. And so here we see a bind, right? The social scientist is kind of in a double bind where they need to share the data, but they also need to anonymize it. And so anonymization and consent is not always clearly defined by funders who require data sharing. Another example is there might be some extra actions you need to take to conform your data to the repository. And so, for example, there was an individual who interviewed drag queens and submitted their data to the website. And part of this is that they saw it was really hard for their intended audience, who were students or even the drag community or scholars, researchers who were looking for drag resources, was they redundantly shared their data in order to enable better findability. So part of making data fair is that the search engine that you leverages the keywords that describe the study. And so in the case of the drag queen study, it was not very easy to find for lay people who do not go to ICPSR, right? They might just search in Google like drag queen interview, but it does not immediately come up high in the search results there. So Another data contortion by this participant was they posted the drag queen interviews on multiple sources. So they made it fit to ICPSR, but it didn't fit well with their actual intended audience. So they posted it on their personal website. They posted them on the university website. They posted them on their website of their class landing page. And so this redundancy was extra time, extra effort, and it made it fit the repository, but it also didn't fit the intended audience. So the social scientists were anticipating the imagined data reuse and their information search strategies. So one kind of spillover effect that we saw because of fitting beyond the data, yes, becoming potentially more fair, was also that new routines had to be created. So we saw that folks were instantiating new lab materials, as we showed earlier, new templates of design, new series of steps you take when you analyze your data. But we also found that sometimes they would choose a topic to be a panel study. So if they thought they would submit their data again to ICPSR, they would not have a one-off study, but they would create a multiple year study so they could submit their data again to ICPSR with the same formatting, with the same metadata and subject headings required there. So in summary, and this is a wild whirlwind tour, there's a paper that we're working on right now that goes into way more depth. It also provides some examples beyond these, is that we did find that social scientists are engaging in data fitting practices. And what does this do? This is making data legible to computers, to repositories, makes it machine readable to repositories. So scientists were also developing or appropriating their own resources to manage and deposit data. And then we also find that decontextualizing data for deposit could be a source of a contortion, right? We're developing this idea that when it's awkward to submit your data, when it's ungainly, is because it's perceived to be antithetical to some qualitative approaches. Oh, it's another great example. You can read the paper. Thinking about methodological approaches. What does it mean to preserve context when you have to anonymize data? What does it mean to preserve context when you, the researcher, are the instrument that gathered that data, that interpreted that data, who possesses that data, right? So part of this also was making data fair and care can conflict with the priorities to protect privacy, again, with anonymization. So where does this leave us? In conclusion, we found that depositing data requires fitting. And part of this broader research project and kind of the goal of looking at the quantification of social science is to understand that data fitting work that is inherent in submitting your data to a repository really matters. It matters because it disabuses us from the imaginaries of, oh, AI just happens. Like, it just takes data from what's out there. In fact, the work of formatting your data, of making your data pristine and clean, is indeed labor, right? That is required and might be highly variable across different labs in the social sciences, given, as we saw before, the research environment, which has not converged on some norms of how that is done and how data is fit. And also, more particular to the social scientists, it helps us to understand the data quality of the data that goes into the repository. It can help us maybe to design features for repositories like ICPSR and Dataverse. Furthermore, it starts to reveal the implications of, again, the quantification of the social sciences on knowledge production itself. And so with that, I am very excited to hear your comments. Maybe post them in the doobly-doo or email me. Here's some of my information. Check out some existing projects on my website and definitely send a tweet over for thinking about similar things in your work. And overall, I am excited to see you potentially at another 4S conference and beyond.